go back to the conductors of the 40s and 50s, this is how everybody got started. And particularly if you have a passion for opera, you learn the music and the whole business of an opera house from the ground up. And it was based on this that I went to work with Daniel in Bayreuth, because I had already played the Ring Cycle in Cologne, and I was recommended to him by my then boss in Cologne. I was already conducting a mix of repertoire in Cologne at the time. And so when I started to work for him, and then he invited me to join his company in Berlin, I already had a repertoire of about 20 operas that I'd conducted under my belt and a number of symphony concerts. But in Berlin, I was given the opportunity to conduct the very significant repertoire of Wagner and Strauss, the major operas of Verdi, contemporary music. It was really a step up. And at the same time, I started to guest conduct in Vienna. That was the time a great many of my international debuts took place. Daniel was always completely inspirational, because as a musician, as a pianist already, of course, I admired him greatly. And his philosophy that everything comes out of the music completely agreed with everything I had always felt about not just conducting, but about making music generally. And so, Daniel has been responsible for helping and launching the careers of many conductors who are now in significant positions around the globe. And it's because he encourages us to think very, very deeply about the work. He always says he doesn't teach us as one would think in the classical form of teaching, but there's a lot of discussion about why one chooses to make certain decisions, about why one makes certain musical choices. And this, of course, then, and the benefit of working with one of the great German orchestras, the Staatskapelle in Berlin, this was the orchestra of Klemperer, this was the orchestra of Richard Strauss. The tradition within that orchestra, particularly in the German repertoire, is exceptional. And so to do all this repertoire for the first time with that orchestra in that house was, of course, a tremendous opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, this was so impressive. It's also great to see what a great mentor he was in ways that sound a different kind of empowerment from what you're saying. I also have to say, I personally have had some amazing experiences watching conductors like Valery Gergiev do Götterdämmerung, and recently I saw Maestro Donald Runnicles perform the whole Ring Cycle in San Francisco. And he allowed me to go to all the dress rehearsals, which is so fun to watch how they put that together. And I just am curious, from your perspective as a Wagner specialist, can you please share more about conducting? I mean, you've done multiple Ring Cycles, which is absolutely fantastic. And I'm just curious about what that experience was like, especially your first one, and then the ones after that. I'm curious.
Well, again, I had a very gentle, if you like, in some ways, and not so gentle in others, introduction to conducting the Ring, in that I conducted the individual operas of the Ring Cycle at various times before I did a complete cycle. So the first one I conducted was, of all things, Siegfried, which I did in Berlin. And then only 2 months later, I conducted my first Walküre at Covent Garden. And then Rheingold and Götterdämmerung joined when I did a complete Ring Cycle in Vienna for the first time, which was, I don't actually remember. I think probably around, I think my first Vienna Ring was 2001, but I might be wrong. Actually, no, it was earlier than that. It was 97. So then when you come to conduct the entire cycle, it's a very different experience. And it depends also very much on how the setup is in the particular opera house where you're performing it. For example, in Hamburg, when I was scheduling it myself, we did the operas quite close together. In fact, we did, at one point, we did this crazy thing for the Wagner anniversary year. We did all 10 operas of Wagner in a space of 2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. And I needed a lot of physiotherapy after that.
I was going to say, like, you even go
but that's why it's important to have a very intimate knowledge of these works. And that means for Wagner, you have to remember everything started with the text.
Yes.
Specifically, he wrote the text himself. So that's where it starts. And he wrote it in backward order. He started with the story of Götterdämmerung and worked backwards. But then started with the music. And then you have this break where he took quite a lot of time off before he came back to complete his ring cycle. So you have also it's not as much as a stylistic break, because the unifying elements of his extraordinary transfigurations of the motives means that the entire thing has one shape. Yes. But there are stylistic differences between Götterdämmerung and the last act of Siegfried and the rest. But it is, I guess for a conductor, it's a little bit like what it must be for an actor to perform all the historical plays of Shakespeare, or for an athlete to perform it at the Olympics. You know, the ring cycle, it's 14.5 hours of music. And sometimes that's spread over 2 weeks. Sometimes it's all happens within 8 days. And you live and breathe and think and dream nothing but Wagner.
Absolutely.
And I have the greatest admiration for my colleagues who learn it from the score from scratch, because I first learned it from sitting at a piano, accompanying the singers, coaching the singers, training the singers, conducting the offstage music, prompting. I mean, really anything and everything to do with the musical preparation of the ring, I had done before I came to conduct it.
Yes.
So
a lot of sense.
That is quite a luxurious preparation.
Actually, it's amazing that you had that opportunity in all those areas of it, and also in terms of the generation. It was kind of natural for that to build up into the final cycles. It sounds like, so it wasn't like an overnight freak out or something, or
exactly. And interestingly, it's exactly the same path that Donald Runnicles traveled. It's the same path that Tony Pappano traveled in London. There are a number of us of our generation. Telemann was a repetitor at one point. So a great many of us of this generation started at the piano in an opera house and really built our work up from there.
Well, this is so amazing to hear that, because it explains a little bit more how you were able to do that, not only the first time, but with multiple cycles.
Yeah.
And then it makes a lot more sense. Thank you. The other question I do have, which was so amazing to me, is that you're such a champion of contemporary music.
Yes.
And which is so great to hear. You were artistic director of Hamburg State Opera and chief music director of Hamburg Philharmonic. And we'd just like to hear a little bit more about your programming of many diverse performances, including the German and world premieres.
Right. Well, it's interesting because it's really only since, I would say, since the 1960s that it's become a kind of a specialization to be focused, or to focus on contemporary music. I mean, if you go back to the great conductors of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, if we're talking Klemperer, I mean, the number of world premieres Klemperer conducted is extraordinary. Yes. And before we even talk about people like Kusevitsky. So, you know, for them, it was natural and normal that the music of their contemporaries should be part of the programming. Mm-hmm. I believe it was with the potential over-intellectualizing of the very heavy-duty serialists of the 1960s, that music, and also the development of the radio orchestras around the globe, meaning that the non-radio orchestras had to fight financially for their existence, which meant programming had to remain, I won't say populist, but it had to remain a little less risky.
Right.
Then really from that time, the music has tended to diverge. And I'm a firm believer that as a conductor, we have the responsibility to promote the music of composers of our time. Now, not anybody, and I think you have to have the judgment and the belief in your own judgment to choose a handful of composers that you are prepared to be an advocate for.
Right, right.
And then to continually and regularly program their music.
Yes.
So that just as people connect Wagner, Strauss, Brahms, Bruckner, Janacek and Britten with me, they also connect Brett Dean with me, who is an Australian composer of my generation, and I have performed a great many of his works. Most recently, his wonderful cello concerto in its New York Philharmonic debut in January. And Brett is a composer in whom I have absolute faith, and he is one of a group. I'm also a great believer that we need to escape our national boundaries with contemporary music. Contemporary composers tend to be limited by the countries they live in. So another composer that I am very keen on is Eun-Suk Chin, who is a wonderful Korean composer. And I also most recently performed her cello concerto also with Alban Gerhard in Cincinnati. That was in January. And so Eun-Suk is another composer who I regularly program. And I believe that just as you find an affinity for maybe Bruckner more than Mahler, or maybe Mozart more than Haydn, you also will find an affinity to certain contemporary composers. But I really do believe this is a responsibility that we carry. Yes. And particularly once you're in the privileged position that I find myself in, where I really have the opportunity to be very hands-on in programming in choosing what I wish to perform, then I can create links between the work of contemporary composers and other works to make people think, oh, okay, now I get it. Because it's creating that chain, now I get it chain, that is so important.
So it's kind of like that long line programming chain that you're creating in a courageous way, because I think so many people, as you said, even in America too, back off from contemporary music because of audiences, and then that's really hard for composers. I worked with a female, basically women composers orchestra for 3 years, and I found how hard it was to find even all their parts and all their scores, and not everything was available. It was really almost like doing detective work. Or like, it was pretty crazy. But what I was impressed with what you just said, Simone, is the ability to kind of have these composer connections and keep them alive and going, which sounds very...
Yes. And then to look for the next generation. So, you know, there's a much younger Australian composer who was a student of Brett's called James Ledger, who I find really quite interesting. And through my German connections, I've met a great many very interesting younger German composers. And I kind of like to keep my fingers, my connections. It also helps to have good connections to publishers. In my case, it's to Boozy and Hawkes in Germany, Boozy and Hawkes in London as well, of course. And they supply me regularly, and Universal in Vienna.
Yes.
And they supply me regularly. They know my tastes. They know what I do. They know the kind of places I work.
Yes.
And they send me suggestions. We think you might like to have a look at this.
That's
because
wonderful.
They're the ones who are always dealing with. And I like very much that kind of proactive work from the publishers. You know, when I was running Hamburg, by the time I left, I had an entire wall bookshelf full of scores that I had promised to look at and that I never got around to. And I felt terribly, terribly guilty. But that is the sad truth of the industry, particularly in a place like that, where I was working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was a crazy, crazy time. But to have then the personal recommendation from a publisher, from a musician that you have faith in, then that is, of course, very useful. And I studied composition. Composition was my major study. While I know that everything I wrote was very, I'm looking for the right word. It referenced too many things. My musical tastes were too broad. To be able to focus and find a voice as a composer. But it equipped me with the skills to be able to look at a score, analyze it relatively quickly, and make a judgment about it, because that's the next thing. In Hamburg, my principle was always not necessarily to do world premieres, but to do the second series of a work, because so often a work is identified with its first performance. And if the first performance is a success, the work is successful. If the first performance is not a success, the work disappears.
Yes.
And we all know the realities of the industry. Sometimes the first performance will not be a success because your singers got sick 2 days before, you didn't have enough rehearsal, the parts arrived late. I mean, there's so many possible reasons. We know so many great works that had unsuccessful first performances historically. Yes. The sad truth is today, most works don't get a second chance.
I so hear you on that. And it's wonderful too that you're doing that second series, not only because of the successes, but because they've probably gotten a lot of the bugs out of it and the things that, you know, when you're first doing that first premiere. So the other thing I was wondering, Ligia, would you like to perhaps add a few questions yourself before I go to my other questions? Love to hear anything. Your microphone needs to go on. Yeah, there we go.
Looking to Simone, I can see a strong woman, and I think that maybe she didn't have problems for being a woman conductor, no? But as this symposium is for women conductors, and in general, they have many problems with this, I would like to ask to you, dear Simone, if you, in your beginning, if you had some problem for being a woman, okay?
I think the fact that I began my musical career without intending to be a conductor was a help. I was never ambitious in saying, this is what I want to do. I was a pianist. I was working at the opera, and I was working in amateur and community theater. And invariably, I would find I was the best informed person in the room, and I would end up conducting. Now, this is probably easier in a place like Sydney than it is in a great many other countries, simply because Australia, and Sydney in particular, is geographically so far away from everywhere else that, for example, when the conductor became ill for a performance, which is how I got my first main stage performance. I was doing the children's operas and the contemporary chamber works and things, but to get my first main stage performance, the conductor became ill in the morning. They couldn't fly somebody in from Bonn or Berlin or Vienna. They'd never get there on time. They couldn't even fly them across from New Zealand. They still wouldn't get there on time. Right. So, you know, if you were the best qualified person on the place, you did the work. It was as simple as that. And Australia was a much more egalitarian society already in the 80s. So it was more open. Yes, it was still very unusual for a woman to be conducting, of course. And I was also very young. I was only 24 when I started to conduct at the opera in Sydney. But this was praised rather than criticized. Of course, I heard stupid things said to me, even just a year before this. One of my seniors said to me, why do you want to try to be a conductor? It will never happen, but you could be one of the greatest assistants in the world. Horrible. But you know, maybe, you know, I'm half Irish and half Croatian, and these are very stubborn people on both sides. And when I was younger, the best thing you could say to me is that there's something that I cannot do, and then I would set out to prove them wrong. So when I got to Germany, which came about, I won some small scholarships, and I had already been conducting in Sydney quite a lot. I was 25, and I had a very fine mentor in Sydney. It was an amazing time at the opera in Sydney. Charles Mackerras was conducting Janacek and Wagner. Wow. There was a wonderful Australian conductor who sadly died very young, called Stuart Challender, who had spent 10 years in Germany and who was very active in the contemporary music world. There was Richard Bonning conducting all the bel canto repertoire and the French romantic repertoire. And there was a wonderful, wonderful Argentinian conductor, Carlo Felice Cilario, who was conducting all the Italian repertoire. Yeah. So it was like a mini masterclass every time you went to rehearsal. And these people, of course, were just happy to find an assistant, a pianist, in whom they could put a great deal of responsibility. So, you know, this was just fine. And it was Stuart Chandler who said, go to Germany. Here in Australia, you're very important already, but you need to learn, you need to study, you need to be in the system. And so I got a job as a repetiteur with the opera in Cologne. And when I started there, I was 26. Wow. I didn't speak great German. I spoke a little German. I was a woman. I was from a country where most Germans only thought kangaroos and swimmers came from Australia. And in those days, we're talking 1987, 26-year-olds were all still at university, and I had been working and conducting already for 2 or 3 years. So I thought to myself, I'm always going to be a woman. I'm going to get older, but it's going to take a while. I'm always going to be Australian, but the one thing I can do something about is my German. So I set out to learn to speak German fluently. And I've continued this passion for languages. I'm so sorry, Spanish is one of the few languages I don't speak, because I can get by because I speak Italian and French. So I can fake it, you know.
Well, we're so excited to hear too that it's almost like you had this little Paris, or kind of this way of all these people in one place giving you this. Yes. It is amazing. That's amazing.
It was an extraordinary time. And of course in Germany, when I first said I didn't want to just stay behind the piano, I wanted to conduct as well. Of course, people laughed at first, and then I got an opportunity and I did the work, and the orchestra were happy, and it went from there. You know, I've always said to myself, you can't expect love from your orchestra. If you are a musician and your instrument is the piano, you don't expect the piano to give you love back. You expect it to work and to help you make music to the best of your ability. And yes, if you are a conductor, you are a musician whose instrument is the orchestra. It's very nice when the orchestra love you, but it's not a necessary part of the job. There needs to be mutual respect, and the respect will come from you being so well informed about what you're doing and standing totally above the technical requirements of what you are doing, so that you are able to use the language of conducting to make a statement with the music. So you see, it's all about the music, and then it's not about you. Yes. And if that is your philosophy, then it really doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman or young or old or fat or thin or whatever you like, because there are 100 reasons why somebody may not like you. But yes, if you know your job, you will have respect.
Yes, and what I love about what you're saying, Simone, too, is it's almost like this being in the zone, that if you're in the musical zone and you're staying in there very fully, then none of that matters, because the music is basically pulling all of us, right?
Exactly. Your focus should be 100% on the music. You yes. are the composer's, it's like you're the composer's advocate. You're the composer's lawyer, if you like. You are his defense or her defense. You are the mouthpiece of these little black dots on a white piece of paper, and you are translating that to an emotional expression or an intellectual expression that resonates with your audience.
Absolutely.
Whether the musicians like you or not, and whether you have to put up with stupid things that even the nicest and most generous of people will sometimes say, like, oh, I've never worked with a woman conductor before. You're marvelous. You think, okay, but what does that have to do with me being a woman?
Yeah. Well, you know, yeah, we so appreciate what you're saying, Simone, too, because really, I think every female here and watching this has experienced these things that are, and people mean them well, but they're kind of patronizing sometimes, or
sure.
Or they're much worse than that, and they don't even realize either, which is kind of problematic. But either way, it's it's really helpful to
but there is the other thing that we should never forget. I mean, the role of the conductor is essentially what began as a 19th century construct. Right. You know, this idea of this person down the front wearing a set of tails, conducting, directing a large group of people. You know, this is a 19th century thing, and women were invisible in the 19th century. So, and it has traditionally always been classical music, which has been the art form that was slowest to change, but the one that could create the most potent change.
Yes.
Just this morning, I was watching a movie about the Bronte sisters. Mm-hmm. And there was a line, the title of the movie was to walk invisible. And because they published under male names, they were determined to walk invisible, to let their work be what mattered and not themselves. Yes. And I thought that is actually a very nice concept for us as well. I mean, there is no denying it. There is an ingrained bias in the industry, or there has certainly been an ingrained bias in the industry that says this is a man's job. If you stop somebody in the street and say, what does a conductor look like? They're going to describe Lenny Bernstein or Herbert von Karajan or Simon Rattle.
Right.
You know, that is what they think a conductor looks like.
Actually, what you're saying is very fascinating, because I think on the panel later today, we have a USA panel, and one of the issues that I personally will also be talking about is the inherent ability for women to, because of our creativeness and collaborational kind of abilities, to kind of overcome that very stereotype you're talking about. So it's no longer a Toscanini type. We're not shaming anyone. We're trying to create something beautiful and open that up to make that easier for everyone to go higher into that zone together musically.
It's exactly the same as in the corporate world.
Yes.
There are a great many attributes which are given to women in senior positions, where you say they have this potential for more networking, more cross-referencing. These are all qualities that are being encouraged today in a very different way to 20 years ago. Completely different. Just across the whole focus. But so much so that I would have to say that there are now 1 or 2 countries where it is actually now a handicap to be a young male conductor, of all things, because they are actually, there is positive bias towards women in an attempt to redress the balance.
Yes.
I personally am against this, because I believe that gender should be something that is completely outside of the question. To me, I think it then comes down to false equations that we make in our understanding of what it means to be a man or a woman. If we say that masculine equals strength and feminine equals sensitivity, I think we are robbing both genders of great scope. And I think an artist, I think that's one of the marvelous things about being an artist, is that you should explore every facet of your personality, every facet of your emotional scope. And so in a way, when you are working, when you are being an artist, you are in a way actually freed from the constraints of gender.
Absolutely.
And I think today we're living in a world, I mean, I don't know what it's like in many of the countries in which some of the Symposium members are, but for example, in England at the moment, we are living in an environment where gender, particularly in the under 30-year-olds or particularly under 25-year-olds, gender is becoming an extremely fluid concept. Therefore, the old argument, it's a man's job, it's a woman's job, and so on, start to become rather superfluous.
Yes.
And
yes.
They are limiting. And
yes.
Surely it should be our role as artists to be breaking the boundaries, to be going over the limitations, to be stepping beyond that. And I have a very ambivalent attitude to this positive bias, because I think in some ways it actually limits things, because those conductors are then expected to be whatever the world thinks feminine means. I want to see the next generation be a generation of great conductors, great musicians, minds that are expanded, minds that are educated, minds that never stop seeking more knowledge, a deeper knowledge. And that, I think, will create opportunities.
That's very profound. I would like to also open this up to the rest of the people here. Perhaps you would also like to ask her more questions right now.
Yes, I would like to. Could I talk something?
Absolutely.
all things you talked here are marvelous, Simone, but I think for me, the most important are two things that you told. First of all, you didn't pretend to be a conductor. You wanted to be a musician. You
Yes.
were a musician. I always talk the same to young conductors who want to become a conductor or who want to do a career. No, this is crazy for me.
Yeah, it is. It's unthinkable for me too.
Yeah, me also. I when I decided to be a musician, I wanted to be in the music. Even if I had to clean the theater, I wanted to be in the middle of the music, no? And the second thing I think is very, very deep is the most important. The music must be the most important thing, always. You are so deep in the music, your mind, your heart, everything, that people will respect you because you have this music inside.
Yes.
Doesn't matter who you are. You are a man, you are a woman, you are homosexual. It's not important, this. These
Exactly.
people really gets the career, then the people gets the career, but not because the people is looking for the career.
Exactly. You can imagine, I am approached regularly by young conductors, both men and women, who want to work with me as an assistant, I don't teach. I sometimes do conversation master classes, but I don't actually give lessons. But I do believe in mentoring. And I'm now very proud that some young people who have worked with me, some of them not so young anymore, all are making wonderful music, having wonderful performances, some having stellar careers, some having smaller careers, but they are deeply involved in the music. And I'm very proud of this. I think there are two things I would like to add. One is something that I think is very important. This is about the concept that a conductor is a musician. Yeah. Daniel Barenboim always said to me, don't lose touch with your instruments. I know, particularly repetiteurs, when we spend, years playing the piano 7, 8, 10 hours a day, and we start to conduct, you're sort of so pleased to shut the piano and walk away. But as Daniel says, there's nothing we do as conductors that actually physically creates a sound. What we do is, by means of gesture and expression and intention, we make the musicians want to create the kind of sound we want to hear.
Yeah.
But, to keep it real, if you're going to do this for 50 years, to keep it real, you need to be in touch with an instrument and remember how it feels to make a sound. So I keep going back to the piano. Sebastian Weigler keeps going back to the horn. Donald Runnicles keeps going back to the piano. Many wonderful, wonderful musicians, conductors, keep going back to their instruments to find that physical connection with the sound. And the second thing is, Lygia, as you say, the career is not something you try to make. There are artist managements who are very good at directing careers, but that's not your job as the conductor. Your job as a musician is to become the best musician you can possibly be. If I get a letter from a young conductor and they say, and sometimes they might be 14 or 15 years old, a young student, young musician, and they say, I want to be a conductor. Now, unless they've grown up in a household where one of their parents is a conductor, they don't know what it means. What they want to do is what they've seen or think they've seen from the auditorium, looking at the stage and seeing somebody, it's one of the last autocratic professions. You know, there are almost none left, but conducting is one of them for the public, member of the public, because they don't see what we do in rehearsal. But if that person says to me, I am really interested in the role of a conductor, what should I do? And my answer is simple. You become the best musician you can possibly be on your instrument. You study analysis and theory and music history and composition so that you understand how an orchestra works. And you learn languages.
Yeah.
And you don't stop learning. So these are, and fourth, become an all-round person. Read literature, look at art galleries, read philosophy, read history, you know, become as broad a mind as you can be, because all of these things will inform your interpretation of the music. That's why being a conductor is such a fascinating thing, because I mean, I will be 60 next March, and I have a career already for 35 years. And as long as I stay healthy, God willing, and this stupid virus goes away one of these days, I hope I have another 30 years in front of me. Absolutely. And that's 30 years where I don't stop learning. And that's the exciting thing, because everything we learn informs our next performance.
This is so beautifully put, because what you're really talking about to me is the overall cultural kind of abilities to meld things from all areas. Like, for example, it kind of leads into my other question for you. I'm sure when you're doing operas, especially new operas, and they're coming from, you know, with totally new kinds of plots that are not anchored in the old plots that we see a lot, that probably, all those cultural things that you're talking about must really inform that. And one of the questions I had is, with your long relationship with the Vienna State Opera, you know, and I was wondering about your recent production, for example, of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, what that was like, and or other operas you'd like to tell us about that were new, you know.
Well, of course, Midsummer Night's Dream he wrote in 1961, so it's not a new opera. It's the same vintage as me.
Right. It was just a new production. Yeah.
But it was only the second time the work had been performed at the Vienna State Opera. The first time was back in 1962, so when it was very new, and they performed it in German, and they performed it with a tenor in the principal role instead of a countertenor in the role of Oberon, because they didn't have any countertenors in Vienna at the time, so they used a heroic tenor instead. So Vienna hadn't actually heard Benjamin Britten's Midsummer Night's Dream. Mm-hmm. Now, I have a theory that that there's a kind of an unspoken 50-year rule about contemporary music, that anything that was written more than 50 years ago, we find approachable. Anything that is written in the last 50 years, we find more difficult to deal with, unless it falls into that kind of crossover, easy listening, or there are certain musical styles of the 80s and 90s which are much more linked into historic music. Anyway, I think, again, it comes down to bridges. We had a brilliant director, we had a phenomenal cast, and I had the joy of having the Vienna Philharmonic play Britten's beautiful score. Now, there's a certain intellectual stringency, so strictness, that Britten was writing for, because he was writing for the musicians he knew in England in the 1960s. So that's a certain amount of that is not necessarily natural to the Viennese musicians. However, there is a beauty to their sound and a natural way of phrasing that might not necessarily have been automatic to the musicians Britten was writing for. So you're able to mix these elements And that I believe is the role of the conductor, to teach the orchestra what is important about the composer's language, and then to use the sound of the orchestra to speak that language.
Right.
And every orchestra has its own strengths and its own weaknesses, always, like any instrument you play. You might have a beautiful 18th century violin, which has the sweetest sound, but it's actually quite small in the middle register. Or you might have a fantastic Steinway that's just a little dark and heavy at the bottom end. You know, there are always going to be pluses and minuses to every instrument. It's the same with an orchestra. And your role as the conductor is to make the most of the pluses and get rid of the minuses during the rehearsal. I mean, that's putting it very simply, but that's how I approach it. And I think if you as a conductor can express in your understanding of the music, the way you communicate it, and your obvious enjoyment of the music, if you can express that to the musicians, you're going to bring 85% of them along with you for the ride. And the other 15 may come or they may not come, but that doesn't matter.
That's right. That's right. That is so profound, because so many times when we're thinking about new kinds of ways in which we're bringing this orchestra into a new thought, like especially with a premiere, oftentimes there's a lot of resistance around that. But as long as we stay in that kind of zone, I think often that staying in the zone throughout the rehearsals, then when you get to the concert, that little 15% you're talking about, they often do come along, or they at least they don't hurt it.
And the other thing to remember is that, and this is actually really difficult today, and particularly this year when there's so much internet streaming, is that it's not actually, how can I put this? In the communication between the conductor and the musicians in rehearsal is actually quite an intimate environment. And the same in performance, because generally in performance, most of the audience don't see your face. Now, in these days of internet streaming, all that is changing. Yes. And I see a lot of young colleagues with less experience who are making the mistake of performing for the camera instead of trying to communicate in the same intimate way with the orchestra. Now, I fully understand. I find it personally very confronting to know that there is a camera on me. I find it, it upsets me terribly. I have sleepless nights beforehand. I do not want my face, my personal communication with my musicians to be part of the show.
It's very intimate, no? Very intimate.
It's extremely intimate. And but this is simply something that particularly the developments of this year have kind of imposed upon us. So I think maybe it's time for a reminder that rehearsals are not performances. Rehearsals are designed to practice for the performance. And I think even if there are cameras in the room, one mustn't fall into the temptation of performing during the rehearsal.
Right.
I think that's very important. Lydia, you may have one or two questions for me. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the clock. And I have a meeting with Berlin in 7 minutes. So
may I ask one thing, or no time?
You should go then. I would have thousands of questions to you, my dear Simone. You were an example of life, of being, of music. And for us, it's really a great emotion to have you here with us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just say very quickly to everyone, I think the fact, I'm seeing so many of the messages you're sending. Many thanks for all of those. That's really, really lovely. I wish you all the greatest enjoyment and love of what you are doing. And for those of you who are seeking success, also may success come your way. And I can only say as a mantra, focus on the music. The music is what matters. Okay? Many thanks to you all. I'll try to be better at keeping updates on my Facebook page. It's S Young Conductor if you're looking for it. Ligia knows where it is. She's found me there. But I'm not very good at putting updates, and I never put anything personal on there. But if I come up with anything sensible in the next few months, I'll try and stay in touch. Ligia, thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Thank you. We are so grateful to you. Thank you, dear.
Thank you very much, everybody.
The most big happiness to you, what I wish to you.
Thank you so much, and to all of you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, dear.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.